Hey guys, so I made it. First of all, sorry I'm late again. 2 weeks in a row, y'all. It's not good. I have two cameras. I had my laptop set up. I had a camera set up, and I got it to work, and it looked good, and it's been just hanging out for the last hour, literally 2 minutes before 2 o'clock, and my laptop stops working. So we're going back to the iPad again this week. Sorry. It shouldn't be too difficult. Hi, Alicia. So I was just saying my laptop totally just decided it doesn't want to play 2 minutes before 2. I had this whole setup. I've got cameras. I had views. I have my cutting. Yeah, it would have been awesome. But the laptop is having a moment. It's been running for the last hour. Not a problem. The battery's just fine. I turn it on. It turns off. So I get to play with that this afternoon, I think. Or I might just chuck it out the window. I don't know yet. So we are on our Tuesday technique again. We are doing foundation paper piecing. There are two types of paper piecing. There's English, and then there's foundation. Foundation is where you sew onto paper so that you're accurate. You can do all sorts of shapes and blocks, and you can do traditional. You can do log cabins. A lot of people like to do the compass rose or a mariner star with the tiny little itty bitty points. That's all foundation paper pieced. It allows you to use scraps if you want to do a scrappy one. It allows the accuracy to be there. And so it's a fun thing to learn. It's time consuming. It's not just like a 4-patch or something like that. It will take a little time, but it's totally worth it. Today we are doing a rose, or I'm doing a rose. So here is the coloring page that you get, or that this pattern has. So it would allow me to use my colored pencils and color in an audition color. So I could print this page out as many times as I want and audition colors. I started a sample this morning for this. And I didn't like it. So I quickly found more fabric and started another one. But this pattern's really cool because it comes in multiple sizes. It has a 3-inch block, it has a 4-inch block, a 5, and a 6-inch block. I did the 6-inch block because I wanted it a bigger size, and I wanted it to be quick. And I also wanted you guys to be able to see what I was doing. So the first thing I did was I printed out the pattern. This pattern does tell you how to do it, but that's also what I'm going to be showing you. Then what I did was, I don't like to use normal paper for my foundation paper piecing because it's thick and it's hard to get out at the end. And I tend to leave a lot of residue or little pieces in my block. So what I have found that I like is newsprint. I bought a ream of newsprint off of Amazon. It's thin, but it still lets me, there's a couple times I had to rip out and re-sew, and it works just fine. I did rip out some stitches through the newsprint, but it wasn't anything I was really worried about. Hi, Mom. We're on the iPad again. The laptop died, so sorry. Okay. So let me show you what I started with this morning. So this was the middle of my rose. It's kind of a mess. So I was looking to the store yesterday, and I thought, hey, I want to use multiple colors in my rose and go from dark to light. I like the way that looks. So I'll just get some ombre fabric, right? So it goes from light to dark. Well, I think it's a good idea. The problem is that this fabric is really busy, and it just made it look like mud. and I just don't like it. So I ran through my stash, well, and Mom's, because that's kind of gal she is, and I looked through my what is it called, my scrap bag, and I found some teals, and I like this a lot better. So I've done the A. It's sectioned out into 4 sections. So this blue piece is the A, and then this piece is the D. I've done everything but B, so we're gonna do B together, just because it's little. There's not a lot, so I'm not spending an hour on here sewing. I can show you how to start, how to end, worry about seam allowances, all of that stuff. And then we will sew all the other 3 pieces on, and then we can talk about taking off the paper on the back. You leave the paper on until you're completely done with the block. You could probably leave the paper on until you sew all your blocks together on your quilt and take it all off at one time. So this is my, as you can see, here's regular paper. This is my newsprint paper. It's just a ream of paper of newsprint. I bought it on Amazon, and then you can just print it, put it right through the printer like all your other stuff. Doesn't hurt the printer or nothing. So, okay, so the tools that I'm using, I will be using a finger press. This finger press is a piece of wood with a little, it's very simple. It works really well. I like this one. It creates enough friction to get that iron. You can use an iron between each, because you need to press every seam as you go. You can use an iron. Don't use any steam, because paper and steam aren't a good combo. But this works really good. This got me through this whole thing. I pressed it after I was all done. And so as you can see, I still haven't done a final press, but I will this afternoon. The other thing that you should use, this is called Add a Quarter. It's just a little ruler, and it doesn't look too special until you start using it. So if you can see, it's a little thicker on this side than it is on this side. Hi, Dad. And that will help you, as you're piecing, you cut your seam allowance. You cut the seam allowance down to where you want. So that's 1/4 inch is that lip. I have both of these items in the store. I have add an 1/8, which is an even smaller. So instead of 1/4 inch, it's an 1/8 inch. Those are in order. Those are coming in. So if you prefer that one's good. I have a rotary cutter, my cutting mat. And then I've started to use, I like stilettos. I've always used this, well, not always. It comes and goes. It's one of those things that sometimes I'll use a stiletto a lot, sometimes I won't. Just a lot of it depends on what I'm doing too. But this is a tool from Cricut. It basically is like a dentist pick. But I really like it because of how I can hold it and get it up near my presser foot, and I don't have to put my hand at a weird angle. But this will come in handy to get all the paper out of the back. So I have that, scissors, seam ripper in case I need it. All right, so the first piece that we're working on, or the piece that we're working on today, is this little guy. So your pattern will tell you the order that you're doing everything. So this is backwards for you guys. Again, I apologize. But you're going to start at 1 and 2. So that's going to be your first seam. So I'm working on section B, because I have more than one section on this pattern. So section B and section 2 and section 1, excuse me, and section 2 are my green leaves. And I can always refer back to my coloring chart. So this is what it looks like at the end. So if I really wanted to, I could audition colors. This is the section we're working on. Your patterns, if you look, are opposite because of the way you sew it on. So your pattern should be opposite of your coloring page or your final picture. If it's not, it will be when you're done. Just a heads up. So what I'm going to do, here's my green leaf. I need my scissors. My fabric for my green leaf. It's too big, so I'm going to cut it in half. Well, plus I need 2 pieces. So I'm cut it in half. I don't need exact. I don't need perfection. I just need it to be bigger than my B1, my B2, and this seam allowance because they're touching seam allowances. So I need my fabric to cover the seam allowance, B1, and this seam allowance. If it goes over and it covers way up here and way down here, it doesn't matter because I'm going to cut that off. So my first, what you do, your number 1 fabric, your fabric goes on the back. That's why it gets reversed, because you're sewing on the printed side, your fabric goes on the back. So I want my number 1 fabric will always be face up on the back, okay? If you want to pin, you can pin that so that you know my B1 fabric is face up, okay? My number 1 fabric is face up. Now, I'm going to be sewing on this seam. I'm going to be sewing 1 to 2 and 2 together. So I need my number 2 fabric to be face down. So it's going to be face down. I'm going to pin it for you guys. I'm not a pinner typically, but I know a lot of people are. So I need both of my pieces of green, because that's what I'm working on, to cover my seam allowance, to cover their number, and this seam allowance. So 2 needs to cover this and this seam allowance. And I put pretty big chunks, so I'm pretty confident. So now I'm just going to sew right down this seam right here in the middle, between 1 and 2. The nice thing about the numbers is it tells you where to sew. I know that I need to sew between 1 and 2. My next sew line will be number 3 over here. But right now I'm doing 1 and 2. I'm just going to go right down the middle. When I'm sewing, I want a smaller, I like to use a smaller stitch length. I typically, like my machine is set up for a 1.8. That's what I like to sew at. I like the stability it gives when I'm piecing. If I'm doing long strips, I will bump it up to like a 2, 2, 2, somewhere in that range. If I use a smaller stitch on this, it makes it easier to pull the fabric out because you're putting more holes in the fabric, so it's easier to tear out later. The other thing I like to do is I actually do a stay stitch or a locking stitch. So I'll go forward 2 or 3 stitches, go back a couple stitches, and then go forward. And I'm doing that, that's my knot naturally, but I'm also not, a lot of times when you're piecing, you'll sew over your other seams. So there's no need to lock stitch it. But this, you're not really sewing over those seams. So I like to lock stitch it, even if it's just a tiny little seam. I like to cut my threads as I go because they will get in the way. So I've sewed, as you can see, I've sewed down between 1 and 2. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my fabric over on that, or excuse me, my paper over on that seam. Here's my seam allowance, right? But it's too big. So that's where this ruler, handy dandy ruler, comes into play. And that lip, we're going to put that lip on the paper. So it kind of locks it in. So now I can see that my seam allowance is too big. I am going to cut it. You don't get to watch me cut it because technical difficulties today. It's not one thing, it's another, you guys. But we'll get there. And it looks like I need to put a new blade in my cutter. So I cut it. There's exactly a 1/4 inch. It's pretty handy, especially when you're using scraps, and that way you don't have to like pre-cut anything. It just kind of goes together. So now I'm going to unfold my paper. I'm going to open up my fabric, and there's that seam. It went from here to here. It's kind of short, but I'm going to finger press it a little bit with my fingers, and then I'm going to use my handy dandy wood piece here, and I'm going to rub it along. I'm just going to, like I'm drawing on that line, I'm just going to run it along that seam because I want to fold that fabric. And there's enough friction in that piece of wood that that keeps that down. And it's not even an iron. It just works. It's great. All right, so now we're going to flip this back over. And as you can see, I made my seam allowances on the side and then some. Now we're going to do this little tiny piece up here. And I'm going to cut off just a little piece of white because I don't need that big of a piece. So I don't need to have this huge strip hanging out. It's just going to get in the way. So my very inaccurate piece, it's going to cover piece number 3. That's 3, right? Yep. Number 3 and my seam allowances. Okay. And it doesn't matter that this green overlaps it because just like we did here where we cut the seam allowance, we're going to do that at the for this one as well. So I'm going to look at my print because remember we sew it on the good side. We sew from the good side. I need to put my white, make sure I put it, I guess it doesn't really matter, so that it is above my seam, which is right here. So I can kind of, sometimes I'll pull down the green and you can see the, because this is newsprint, so it's thin. You can see through it pretty easily, especially if you hold it up to the light. So I'm going to kind of position it so that I know it's above my seam. Hi, Mia. Thank you. If you want to pin it, you can pin it. I'm not a pinner. I'm going to put my fabric on the bed of my machine because we're sewing on the picture side. Okay. I'm going to do my stay stitch. This is a very little, very short seam. So I'm probably putting as many stay stitches as I am regular stitches, but that's all right. It's worth it. All right, I'm gonna clip my threads, get them out of the way, especially with these little pieces, they just get in the way. So you can see my little itty bitty seam that I sewed. Next step, fold your paper down over that seam. Line up your add a quarter ruler. And it will hook. You know when you do like a 4-patch and you iron it opposite and then they kind of hook together? That's what this is doing. This is hooking onto that paper so that I can cut straight on that line. So let me cut that real quick for you. And if you just sort of do everything in the same order every time, you're not going to get messed up. Okay? So there's my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to flip my paper and flip my fabric up. See, it covers all my paper, all my seam allowances for the edge of the block. That's what this is. This is for when we sew these little pieces of the block together. I'm going to take my handy dandy press. There's one gentleman that I follow on Facebook who does paper piecing and is a master. He uses a roller, like a wooden roller. So there are many options for finger presses out there. Just find what you like. Okay, so piece number 3 is covered. Piece 4 is right over here. It's just another little guy. So I'm going to lop off, technical term, lop off another little piece of white fabric. This is a really big piece, but that's okay. Okay, so I want to sew on this line with number 2. Okay, so I'm going to set my fabric so that it covers my seam allowance, and you can see it if you, can you see that? So there's my seam allowance, or my seam. So I just need to make sure that my white is above that seam allowance and that it's going to cover, once I flip it over, and press it, it's going to cover this piece and the seam allowance for the block. And it's a pretty big piece of fabric, so I'm confident that it will fit. So we're going to do another tiny little seam. Lock it in. Thanks, Mia. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and post them and ask. If I'm going too fast or if I'm going too slow, whatever. Just let me know. If you can't hear me, you can hear me. I don't know. All your gripes. So here's our tiny little seam. Again, we are going to fold down our paper, do our add a quarter or add an eighth, whichever ruler you have. Oh, there we go. Lock it in. Lop it off. And you can feel it like catch. It's really nice, these rulers. So there's our seam allowance. Flip our paper back up. Turn our fabric over. Now the times that I've had to rip out was because I wasn't paying attention, and when I flipped my fabric over, it didn't cover everything. Thanks, Sue. So, but I've cut extra big pieces, so I know it's covering everything. All right, so our next seam is this one right here. And it'll be our last one. So that's a 5. That's B5, upside down and backwards for you guys. Sorry. So I'm going to take a piece of my white, kind of eyeball it so that it's bigger than what I need. This can also be, once you get used to it and you're comfortable with the process, you can go into your scrap bag and find like the tiny little scraps. I mean, like, look how little number 3 was. Like, that's just a tiny little piece. So we can go into our scrap bags and find all sorts of stuff that would work in paper piecing, because you're not putting it under the machine willy-nilly. It's being sewn to paper. So because of that, it's stabilizing it. So feel free to use all your scraps. This is a nice scrap buster. All right, so I was just kind of playing with it, making sure that when I flip this over, it's going to cover my seam allowances and everything. So I'm going to sew this last seam. My machine, I could set up to stay stitch for me when I start and stop. I forget. So I just do it myself. I know, I call it stay stitching. What do you guys call it? Knotting? I guess it's knotting the thread. I don't know. Trim to my threads. Fold my paper. Now I'm going to do my add a quarter and trim down my seam allowances. If I was more comfortable with the process, I wouldn't have to have so much waste when I do my cutting my seam allowances. So I cut my seam. Oh, see? Look, y'all. I even thought I did it right. I totally didn't do it right. So, like I was saying, sometimes I don't do it right, but that's all right. It won't take me but a moment to cut it out, and then we can. I just zigged when I should have zagged, huh? Get in there. Oh, back stitching. Yeah, that's one way. That is definitely a good term. Stay stitch, back stitch. I don't know. But the crappy thing about having the shorter stitches and the back stitching or stay stitching is ripping it out. It's no fun. Because I'm trying to take the stitches out without ripping it through the super thin newsprint. But if I do rip it through the newsprint, it's not the end of the world, because I can still see the line. The newsprint's just my guide and my stabilizer. This piece is big enough that I don't need the stabilizing aspect of it. So if I pull my stitches through the paper, it's fine. And I know that because I've done this 3 times today. So there is some experience talking right there. All right, let's see if we can do this. All right, so I'm going to cover and then flip. I have to think about it. So if I'm not sure, I'm going to pin it. So I pinned it right, well, it's below where the seam is. But that way that I can pretend that I sewed it and make sure that it covers. And it does. I got it right this time. Thanks, Kathy. So now I'm going to sew that seam again. See, we all make mistakes. It's all right. Okay, so how many people sew barefoot? I definitely prefer to have my foot without socks or shoes on my presser foot. So I sewed my little seam. Look, I did it again, you guys. I even, I know what I did. It needs to come up just a little bit this way, but it's only, look, if you can see through the light, it only cuts off just a tiny little bit of the, so you can kind of see it there. So I'm just going to keep it. In the interest of time, oh, look, I even did things out of order, but that's okay. I can go back, fold my paper, trim my seam, and then press it. There has been a couple times where I did things out of order and I pressed it with my little finger press. And then I went to fold it for cutting the seam allowance, and I almost forgot to fold the fabric down. So I would have, yeah, it would have been bad, but that's all right. I didn't do that. All right, so I covered all 5 squares or pieces, what have you. If I had a hot dry iron, yeah, Katie, I wear slippers and then I take that 1 foot out and that's my driving foot. But yeah, I prefer definitely to sew barefoot. All right, so if I had a hot dry iron, I would iron this. It's in the other room, so I don't. That's all right. So now I'm going to take my straight edge. I'm going to cut this out so that all I have are my seam allowances on the sides. Let me see here. There we go. Look, if my computer didn't decide it needed a break today, y'all could be watching me cut. Doesn't that sound exciting? Be able to watch me cut? You're not missing a whole lot. But I am actually using this add a quarter ruler to cut. I'm not sure that's the most genius idea, but it works. All right, so cut out my little leaves. Now I'm going to refer back to my coloring diagram, and this was B. So remember, here's my coloring guide. So this is the B part down here. So I'm going to sew my B to my A. And I am going to remind myself where that is. So I'm going to kind of lay what I have already done. And it's going to go down here at the bottom. Remember, your pattern and your coloring diagram are opposite. They are mirrors of each other, so that when you are done sewing this together, they are no longer mirrors. And this time I am going to pin in the corner. I'm going to pick a corner. So here's one of my corners into my seam allowance, and I want to put that pin into the corner of the seam allowance on the other side. Now luckily, it's white fabric on this newsprint, so it's very easy to see through. And I want to match up my other corner, because when I sewed this one, you can see I got it right on the line, because that was the side that was up. I didn't do so good on the back, so it was off just a little bit. I didn't feel like tearing it out. I might in a little bit. But if I can line these points up, that would work a little bit better. Come on now. That'll keep me in the right area. Okay, there we go. So now that I've got those lined up, I am going to actually just pin it normally. I forget where the camera is. All right, so now I'm going to sew along my seam allowance here. So my blocks together, I guess. I'm also going to stay stitch this or back stitch. I personally do not sew over pins. It can really jack up your machine. It can mess up all of this timing and stuff in here. So I never sew over pins. Okay, I'm not going to say never, because there's always exceptions, right? So if I can help it, the majority of the time I do not sew over pins. See how I did? Oh, I did pretty good on that one. So there's the back side, the bottom. Here's the top. I kind of got a crease. I wonder if that's on the fabric too. Nope, just in the paper. Yay! All right, so we have one more piece to put on here that I did earlier today. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to, actually, let's finger press this just to kind of help it relax a little bit here. There's a lot of fabric going on in all these seams. There's a lot of fabric in there, so I want it to lay flat for me. All right, so here's my C block. I'm going to do it just like that B block, where I'm going to match up my points. This one's kind of nice because they already cut off my dog ears for me. So maybe I'll eyeball this one and see how I do. See if I get it right or close enough. I don't know. I'm not a pinning person, but I could see the accuracy goes way up when you do pin. So I have mad respect for it. I think maybe I'm just too impatient. I don't know. I don't like to pin. This one isn't a whole bunch of points trying to meet in one spot, so if I don't pin and it's not exactly right, it's all right. I'm a middle child. Close enough is good enough for me. Especially on like this. This doesn't really matter too much. I was a little off. Again, not the end of the world. Nobody will ever know. So there's my little rose. So it's nice because it allows me to create accuracy. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with paper piecing. I love to go on Pinterest and see what's going on. I had this all pulled up, but it was on my iPad that I was going to show you. on the other camera, but it won't take me long to look for it. So I looked up paper piecing patterns. And the stuff that these people come up with, I mean, these patterns are amazing. Traditional patterns, not traditional patterns. Look at that boxer, he's so adorable. And then there's this cute butterfly. That's all I did was look up paper piecing. I love this fire. And that paper airplane, paper pieced. You can get the look of curves. It takes a lot of tiny little pieces to get around the curve, but it's all right. It's the look of curves, but it's not curved. Let me see if I can find. There's all sorts of animals, and just the amount of things that you can do in paper piecing is amazing, because you can get these tiny little pieces and not lose them in your feed dogs. So that's really helpful. The other person, so the gentleman I was telling you about, his name is George Siciliano. I don't know, I'm not Italian. This is his page. Siciliano. And what he does is he does paper piecing, but miniature, like insanely miniature. Let me show you this one that he did. He has patterns and all sorts of stuff. He has a website. Look at that. How stunning is that? Do you want to know how big it is? 22 inches by 22 inches. Over 6,000 pieces. I mean, tiny. This one is even done in silk. Like, not to make it any more difficult. But his stuff is amazing and beautiful. 6,522 is the name of that quilt, because that's how many pieces were in that. I think that was his silk one. It's insane. Yeah, 100% silk. 22 by 22 inches. Yeah, oh my God. 100%. Like, that's insane. I don't know if I could do that. You can go to his website, georgesiciliano.com. Look him up on Facebook. He does tutorials as well. He's the one that used the roller. But he's just amazing. And what I love about men quilters in general is a lot of them love geometrics. I think it's just easier for guys. There's a couple male, well, not a couple. There's one guy who does patterns, and it's all geometric. If my dad's going to pick a quilt, it's typically a geometric quilt. That's just what appeals to guys a lot of time. These are all log cabins, which is just, I can't get over him. But anyway, so this is the back, going back to us. Now that I'm done drooling over George. So here's the back of my paper. I put all my pieces together, and I'm ready to take the paper out. So what I'm probably going to do is I'm just going to use my tool and just start lifting paper out. I can take my little fingers. See? Pretty easy. Go into the next. I don't want to pull up any threads. So I kind of poked it in the middle of the paper. See, I'm doing it backwards, so I can't see what I'm doing. And this paper is nice and thin because it is the newsprint paper. You guys know what newsprint is. But I am just... Here, let me stand up and do it so I can show you guys what I'm doing. Oh, found some seam allowance. All right. I've already started this one, so I am just pulling paper out. But this thing's nice. It's pretty sharp, so it lets me get in there. So I'm going to maybe score it or see how I can get behind the paper. But I don't want to do it at the seams because I don't want to pull any of my sewing out. I just want to make a mess with all this paper. So if I'm going to get into, let's see, there's a bunch of like little paper here in the corners. I might take tweezers and pull it out. I might not. Depends on what I'm doing with the block. So this one, but this is when your short stitches come in handy. So keep those stitches short. Onion skin paper. Oh, I had no idea I've never heard of that, Alicia. But I like the shorter stitches with this paper, and it just makes it, when it's time to take off the paper, makes it a lot easier. So, does anybody have any questions, thoughts, ideas, anything? Some of the times I don't even need to use the, oh, vellum. Yeah, I use that a lot in design school. But how hard is that to pull out of the back? That seems like, I guess maybe I'm used to thick stuff for design. I don't know. I have to look at it. I know that there are some quilters who make their own paper. I've just found that this works, and it's fairly reasonable. Oh, it pops right out. Do you use your shorter stitch too, Alicia? I used a 1.8, which is actually my normal, what I normally use when I sew. But I bet it doesn't rip that much either. I bet it just, with all the perforations, it does. It's kind of like a plastic, like a thin plastic paper. Cassie built a fort on the couch today, so she's been hiding out in that.
Not done with it.
Oh, and she's not done. Apparently it's staying. That's all right. So also don't forget to take your paper out of your seam allowances on the edges too. So anyway, I'm just going to sit here and pull some of this out. If you guys have any questions, let me know. And we can get those answered. I do have the add a quarter ruler at the shop. I also have that this handy dandy presser finger press. I love that it tells us the side for the right-handed people, and then the other side is for the left-handed people. But they print it right on there. Keep the confusion away. So, but yeah, I think that's it. Okay, Alicia says that she uses the vellum and then she uses a shorter stitch. Yeah, I think the shorter stitch is key when doing paper piecing. That's the only time I've used it, because when you're cutting for normal piecing, like say you're doing strips or whatever, your seam allowance is already built in. This, you have to build in the seam allowance. So as far as I know, yes, Katie, this is the only time that I use my add a quarter ruler. It's just for this technique. Good question though. I'm sure that there's other times that you use it. There's also, like, this is the short one. This one's only 6 inches long. But if I was doing like some of the stars, they can be like big pieces. There's 12-inch one of these too, I think. 9 or 12. Can't remember. But there are longer rulers for those instances. Like, this stuff is coming out pretty quick. I've seen some people where they kind of like, you can work it. We've already bent it. We've already sewn through it. For the most part, it just pops right out. Protect your stitches. Don't just go to town with it. Be thoughtful about it. We don't want to make anything cattywampus, because, you know, a lot of times when we're piecing normally, we are working on straight of grain. or should be anyway. This we're not necessarily. So just be gentle to your stitches because you can really get it all out of whack pretty quickly. Alicia, I think you have a quilt store in your sewing room too, so I'm not surprised. But you can see the back after I've taken most of the paper out, how nice the seam allowances are. And once I get it pressed, it'll be nice and flat. So that's what the add a quarter. Do I have to do it? No, but look how much nicer this is if I didn't use the ruler. I could just eyeball it instead of using the ruler, which I've done on some like smaller things. Like for my quilt guild, we did a paper piecing for our name tags, and that one I just eyeballed. I didn't use my add a quarter. So, any other questions or thoughts? I think next week I am going to play with a 60-degree ruler. I'll probably do that for a couple weeks. I love 60-degree rulers. I love working with like a border print and making cool table runners or placemats or all that fun stuff with them. So, oh look, I didn't quite, the green, I guess there was a couple spots where I barely made it into the sewing. It didn't make it into the seam allowance much, but that's okay because it got caught up in there and it was enough to hold it where it needed to be held. So if you don't make it quite to the seam allowance or to the edge of the seam allowance, it's okay. Just so long as you can get it to where you need it. What time am I open tomorrow? The store is open 10 to 5 every day except for Sunday. Sunday, it's 11 to 5. So Shelly will be in tomorrow for me. Tomorrow's my true day off. Today, as you can tell, I'm at home. But I get to do this. And so this is what I usually set up for in the morning. Get my computer all set up and then have it die right before I start. So that's pretty awesome.
Amazing.
So at first I thought the battery wasn't charged or something, but that wasn't it. I don't know why Windows had a moment or is having a moment. So we get to play IT specialist today. I'm almost done taking out all this paper. Make a nice little pile over here. So, that's it for the paper. Sorry, I don't have an iron out here to give you the final pressing, but you can see what's going on. And then the back is pretty nice too. So you're gonna get some bulk, like here where there's a lot of stuff happening in the corner, but it's not awful. You can see that I left a bunch of paper still in like the little corners here. If I had been using normal copier paper, that would have been a lot worse. And I would have been a lot harder to take out all the paper. And I probably would have stretched some of my seams so that when I go back and do my final pressing, it wouldn't have laid as flat as this will once I press it. So I definitely recommend the newsprint. Alicia has used vellum or onion paper, onion peel paper, onion skin paper. I have not. I'll have to give that a whirl and see how that goes. But I think that's it for the day. If you guys had any last minute questions, let me know and we can get those answered. But there is, I've seen on Pinterest, which is always like my first go-to for patterns, Disney princesses. I mean, something as simple as triangles or diamonds. You can do a lot with paper piecing, and it just allows you that accuracy without having to cut straight of grain as much. So there's a lot of flexibility in it. But anyway, I think that's it. If you guys have any last minute questions or thoughts, just let me know. And I think that's it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload this up to YouTube. So it'll be on the YouTube channel probably within an hour. And then from there, I will email it out so that everybody gets to view it if they want to. So anyway, thanks for joining me today. Next week will probably be a 60-degree triangle. Some options with that and what you can do. And I'll probably do a couple of lessons on that triangle because I love it and it's fun. So anyway, thanks for joining me and I will see you guys soon. Take care.
My fort is complete.
Oh, that's the wrong button.